In 865 AD, a fleet arrived on the coast of East Anglia carrying something England had never confronted before. Not another raid. Not a seasonal plundering expedition that would vanish with the first winter storms. This was an army designed to stay. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records it with unusual specificity, a great heathen army. The choice of words matters. Chroniclers who had documented Viking attacks for 70 years knew the difference between a raiding party and what beached on those shores. Contemporary sources suggest between 1,000 and 3,000 warriors, though some modern estimates push higher. The exact number matters less than the composition. This force brought blacksmiths, horse handlers, and supply trains. It carried siege equipment. It planned to winter on English soil. Leading this invasion was a coalition of chieftains, brothers from the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok's lineage according to later sagas. Among them was Ivar, known by a nickname that has puzzled historians for 12 centuries, the Boneless. The epithet appears in multiple independent sources, Old Norse sagas, Irish annals, Anglo-Saxon chronicles. Whatever it meant, it stuck. Here's what makes Ivar's role remarkable: he shouldn't have been leading armies at all. Medieval nicknames served as identifiers in oral cultures where multiple people shared common names. They described defining characteristics. Eric the Red had red hair, Harold Bluetooth had a dead tooth, Ivar was boneless. The Old Norse, Banelos, offers no easy interpretation. Later Romantic sagas, written centuries after his death, invented fantastical explanations. The saga of Ragnar Lothbrok, composed around 1400, claims Ivar was born with cartilage instead of bones, carried on a shield into battle, possessed supernatural strategic vision to compensate for his physical limitations. These are literary inventions. But they emerged from something real. Contemporary sources suggest a physical condition that affected Ivar's legs or mobility. The Irish annals, which tracked Viking movements with careful attention to leadership changes, distinguish Ivar from other commanders but offer no elaboration on his condition. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle mentions him leading armies but never describes him in combat. Skaldic poetry, which celebrated warrior prowess in exhaustive detail, praises Ivar's cunning but never his swordsmanship. The pattern points to a commander who directed rather than fought. In Viking culture, this was unusual. Leadership and combat prowess were inseparable. Chieftains led from the front. A jarl who couldn't fight was like a smith who couldn't forge, holding a title he couldn't perform. Yet Ivar commanded the most successful Viking campaign in English history. Understanding how requires understanding what England looked like in 865, and how fundamentally the Vikings misread what they were invading. When the great heathen army landed, England didn't exist. The word referred to a linguistic and cultural grouping, not a political entity. 4 major kingdoms divided the island: Northumbria in the north, Mercia across the Midlands, East Anglia along the eastern coast, Wessex in the south. Each had its own royal line, army, laws, and ambitions. They shared Christianity, Old English language, and centuries of mutual warfare. Northumbria and Mercia had spent the 8th century competing for dominance. East Anglia maintained precarious independence between larger neighbors. Wessex had expanded aggressively under recent kings. This fragmentation should have been obvious to Viking commanders. They'd raided these coasts for decades, traded in English ports, and certainly interrogated captives. Yet the invasion plan suggests they expected something different. The army's initial target was East Anglia, not to conquer, but to establish a base. King Edmund of East Anglia provided horses and supplies in exchange for peace. This wasn't submission, it was standard diplomacy. Edmund bought time, and the Vikings got mobility and winter quarters. A transactional arrangement both sides understood. But what happened next reveals the Vikings' fundamental miscalculation. In 866, they rode north into Northumbria and seized York. York was the second city of England, an economic hub where roads converged and trade flowed. It had Roman walls, stone churches, established bureaucracy. Taking it should have triggered an immediate, unified English response. It didn't. Northumbria was in civil war. King Osbert had been overthrown by Aella, a nobleman of uncertain lineage. Both claimed legitimacy. Neither controlled the full kingdom. When York fell on November 1st, 866, the rival kings were still fighting each other. The Vikings settled into York and waited. They fortified the Roman walls, established supply lines, and prepared for a siege that didn't come. Not in November. Not in December. Not through the winter. This delay wasn't caution. It was paralysis. Osbert and Ella couldn't organize a response without acknowledging each other's authority. Every strategic discussion became a negotiation about precedence. Who would command? Whose troops would take the vanguard? What would happen after victory? By the time they finally marched together in March 867, they'd given the Vikings 5 months to prepare. The attack on York failed catastrophically. Both kings died in the fighting. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle's entry is terse, and both the kings were slain. Northumbria effectively ceased to exist as an independent kingdom. The Vikings installed a puppet ruler, Egbert, who governed at their pleasure. They now controlled the north. This should have terrified the remaining English kingdoms. It didn't, not enough. Because each assumed they were different. Northumbria had fallen due to civil war, they reasoned. We have unity. We'll be ready. They were wrong about what made them vulnerable. The great heathen army's seizure of horses from East Anglia transformed the strategic equation in ways England's kings failed to grasp. Vikings were sailors and infantry. Horses were not part of their military tradition. They used ships for mobility, then fought on foot. English forces knew this. Defensive planning assumed Viking armies would move slowly, foraging as they went, vulnerable to interception and harassment. The horses changed everything, not because Vikings became cavalry, but because they became mobile infantry. A force of 2,000 men on foot moves perhaps 15 miles per day, needs to forage continuously, and telegraphs its movement days in advance. The same force on horseback can cover 40 miles in a day, carry supplies, and appear where no army should be. They still fought on foot. Viking tactics centered on shield walls, not mounted charges, but they arrived before defenders could concentrate. This advantage compounded in England's political geography. The kingdoms weren't unified command structures with standing armies. Military service was owed to local lords, who owed it to regional ealdormen, who owed it to the king. Mobilization required messages carried by riders, nobles assembling their retinues, troops marching to gathering points. The system worked for defending against known threats moving predictably. It failed against an army that moved faster than messengers. Ivar understood this. The evidence sits in the campaign's timing and targets. In 867, after securing Northumbria, the Vikings didn't consolidate and defend. They rode back south to Nottingham and Mercia. The move made no strategic sense by conventional logic. Nottingham was inland, far from any water route. It had no economic importance matching York. Attacking it meant penetrating deep into Mercia's heartland without securing the intervening territory. But Nottingham sat at a road junction. Control it, and Mercian forces couldn't concentrate without the Vikings knowing. King Burgred of Mercia assembled an army and besieged Nottingham, but couldn't force an assault. The fortifications, built on a sandstone outcrop, made attacks costly. Burgred requested help from his brother-in-law Ethelred of Wessex. The help came. The combined Mercian-Wessex force surrounded Nottingham with overwhelming numbers. And then nothing happened. The sources are frustratingly vague. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle says no serious battle was fought there. Asser's Life of King Alfred mentions negotiations. The Vikings emerged with a peace treaty, kept Nottingham through winter, then withdrew to York in 868. This non-battle was a victory. Burgred had committed his full strength and achieved nothing. The Vikings demonstrated they could strike into Mercia's core, force the king to call for outside help, and leave on their own terms. The political message resonated. Mercia couldn't protect itself. The pattern reveals Ivar's approach. He didn't seek pitched battles. He sought to expose structural weaknesses in English kingship. Every campaign tested a kingdom's ability to respond, to concentrate forces, to maintain the loyalty of nobles who watched kings fail to protect them. In 869, the army returned to East Anglia. King Edmund, who had bought peace 3 years earlier, now had to decide, submit completely or fight. Edmund of East Anglia had watched the Vikings dismantle Northumbria and stalemate Mercia. He knew the odds. Later hagiographies would present his decision to fight as Christian martyrdom, but the contemporary evidence suggests political calculation gone wrong. East Anglia had maintained independence by playing larger kingdoms against each other. Edmund had no natural allies. Mercia viewed East Anglia as a subordinate kingdom that sometimes needed reminding. Wessex had occasionally supported East Anglian independence to limit Mercian expansion. Northumbria had been neutral or hostile depending on the decade. None would ride to Edmund's aid. He knew this. But submitting meant more than accepting a foreign overlord. Viking control meant their god, their law, their disruption of the church institutions that legitimized royal authority. Edmund's power base rested on his role as Christian king, defender of monasteries, patron of bishops. Submission threatened the entire structure. So he fought. The battle location is unknown. The date was November 20th, 869. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicles account is minimal. In this year the army rode across Mercia into East Anglia and took winter quarters at Thetford. And that winter King Edmund fought against them, and the Danes won the victory, and killed the king and conquered all the land. Later accounts elaborate. Abbo of Fleury's Passion of Saint Edmund, written a century later based on oral tradition, describes Edmund's capture and execution. The Vikings demanded he renounce Christianity and rule as their subordinate. He refused. They shot him with arrows and beheaded him. The martyrdom narrative served medieval purposes, but it obscures the practical failure. Edmund had no winning military option, but fighting wasn't his only choice. He could have done what Burgred of Mercia did: negotiate, pay tribute, accept nominal overlordship while maintaining internal authority. Viking rulers generally preferred compliant local kings to direct administration. It was cheaper and more stable. Edmund gambled that resistance would inspire other kingdoms to intervene or that the Vikings would prove vulnerable once engaged. Neither happened. His army was destroyed. He died. East Anglia became Viking-controlled territory with no negotiated terms, no preserved institutions, no continuity of native rule. The execution was likely not religious persecution. It was political messaging. Edmund had been the first English king to fight the great heathen army in open battle. Making an example of him showed other rulers what happened when negotiation failed. By 870, 3 of 4 English kingdoms were under Viking control or influence. Only Wessex remained fully independent. And the Vikings, methodically working through England's political structure, turned south. Ivar's physical limitations, whatever they specifically were, created an unusual command structure. He couldn't lead from horseback during rapid movements. He couldn't stand in the shield wall. His authority derived entirely from strategic insight and organizational control, not personal prowess in combat. This forced him to build systems rather than rely on presence. The great heathen army operated with unusual coordination for a Viking force. Most raiding parties were essentially armed mobs unified by a charismatic leader who proved himself in battle. When that leader died, the force fragmented. The great heathen army continued functioning across multiple campaigns, leadership transitions, and strategic pivots. The evidence appears in winter quarters. Viking armies needed to feed themselves for months without fighting. This required negotiated supply arrangements, stored provisions, and disciplined consumption. Raids could grab food opportunistically. Armies needed logistics. Contemporary sources mention the Vikings taking winter quarters at Thetford, York, Reading, Cambridge, Repton. Each represented a calculated choice. These weren't random camps. They were fortified positions near agricultural centers with defendable terrain and access to routes for rapid movement. Someone was planning multiple steps ahead. The army also maintained battlefield discipline unusual for Viking forces. Shield walls required training and practice. Individual warriors seeking glory broke formation. The great heathen army fought cohesively, withdrew in order, and preserved its strength across repeated campaigns. This systemic approach matched Ivar's constraints. He couldn't inspire warriors with personal combat achievements, so he built an organization that worked regardless of who led individual battles. His brothers, Halfdan and Ubba, according to later sources, handled the heroic leadership. Ivar handled the mechanics of conquest. The division worked because Viking culture, despite its emphasis on warrior prowess, recognized different forms of leadership. Skalds who composed poetry didn't fight. Law speakers who memorized legal codes weren't warriors. A commander who couldn't personally fight but delivered victories violated no fundamental principle, provided the victories kept coming. In 870, when the army invaded Wessex, they were testing whether their system could break the last independent English kingdom. King Athelred of Wessex had been watching the Viking campaigns for 5 years. He'd sent troops to help Mercia at Nottingham. He'd seen Edmund's defeat. He knew exactly what was coming. Wessex had structural advantages the other kingdoms lacked. Its royal succession had been unusually stable. While Northumbria tore itself apart in civil war and Mercia struggled with disputed claims, Wessex's royal line passed smoothly from Ethelwulf to his sons, Ethelbald, Ethelbert, Athelred. Each transition was managed. Each new king inherited functioning institutions. Wessex also had depth. The kingdom's heartland lay in the southwest, far from easy Viking approach. An army marching overland from East Anglia had to cross multiple river lines and could be harassed the entire way. Ships approaching by sea faced limited landing points along a hostile coast. Most critically, Wessex had Alfred. Ethelred's younger brother was 21 in 870, serving as secondary king, leading troops in his brother's name while learning governance. Later chronicles would Leonize Alfred as the greatest English king. In 870, he was an untested commander facing the most successful Viking army in English history. The Vikings established their base at Reading, where the Thames and Kennet rivers met. The position offered water access, defensive advantages, and a base for raiding into Wessex's agricultural heartland. A standard Viking strategy: fortify a position, force the enemy to attack, or let them watch their kingdom be plundered piecemeal. Athelred and Alfred attacked. The first engagement was a raid on a Viking foraging party. Alderman Ethelwulf of Berkshire caught Vikings outside Reading's fortifications and won a sharp fight. Minor tactically, but it proved the Vikings were vulnerable when dispersed. 4 days later, the main Wessex army attacked Reading itself. The assault failed. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, and 4 days later King Athelred and his brother Alfred fought against the whole army at Reading, and there was great slaughter on both sides, and Alderman Ethelwulf was killed, and the Danes had possession of the battlefield. The pattern was establishing itself. Wessex could win skirmishes but couldn't break the fortified Viking position. The stalemate favored the invaders. They had secure supply lines back to East Anglia, controlled territory, and could wait for Wessex's army to disperse. Then the Vikings made their first significant error. They left Reading and offered battle at Ashdown. The Ashdown battlefield was a ridgeline in Berkshire. Vikings held the high ground. The Wessex army approached uphill, which should have been suicide against a prepared shield wall. Why the Vikings left their fortification to fight in the open is unclear. Possibly they saw an opportunity to destroy Wessex's field army in a single engagement. Possibly overconfidence after Reading made them aggressive. Possibly they wanted to demonstrate Wessex's helplessness before returning to systematic plundering. The sources describe the Viking army arrayed in 2 divisions. One led by Ivar and his brothers, one by jarls and lesser commanders. The Wessex army matched the formation. Athelred commanded one division, Alfred the other. Here the sources pause on a peculiar detail. Athelred refused to attack until he finished hearing Massachusetts. Alfred, facing the Viking army advancing downhill, had to decide, wait for his brother and risk being overrun, or attack undermanned. He attacked. The detail appears in Asser's Life of King Alfred, written by someone with access to Alfred's own account. Like a wild boar, Alfred charged uphill into the Viking line around a single thorn tree, a landmark specific enough that it suggests eyewitness memory. The fight was brutal. Athelred arrived and joined the battle. The shield walls ground against each other for hours. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle lists Viking casualties by name, King Bagsec and 5 earls. High losses among commanders suggest the battle was closer than later accounts implied. The Vikings broke and retreated to Reading. Wessex celebrated its first major victory against the great heathen army. It meant almost nothing. 2 weeks later, the Vikings defeated Wessex at Basing. 2 weeks after that, they won at Meriton. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle admits the pattern. And after this battle there came a great summer army to Reading. Reinforcements arrived from Scandinavia. The Vikings had supply lines and recruitment networks. Wessex had casualties it couldn't replace. Ashdown demonstrated that Vikings could be beaten in open battle. It didn't demonstrate that Wessex could win the war. The strategic equation hadn't changed. The Vikings still held Reading, still controlled East Anglia and Northumbria, still had mobility and initiative. In April 871, King Athelred died. Wounds from Meriton? Possibly, though sources don't specify. Alfred became king of the last independent English kingdom at 22, inheriting a war he couldn't win. The summer of 871 brought something unprecedented. The Vikings accepted payment to leave Wessex. This requires unpacking. The payment wasn't tribute to acknowledge Viking superiority. It was a negotiated settlement between exhausted parties. Wessex had fought 9 battles in a single year, a catastrophic level of military mobilization. The FYRD system, which required farmers to serve for limited periods, was breaking down. Men needed to plant crops or there would be nothing to defend. The Vikings had also been hurt. They'd won most engagements but taken steady casualties across repeated battles. Viking armies depended on success to maintain recruitment. Warriors joined campaigns expecting plunder and glory. A grinding war of attrition in Wessex delivered neither. So they negotiated. Alfred paid. The Vikings marched to London, then into Mercia. In 873 to 874, they systematically destroyed Mercian independence. King Burgred, who had ruled for 22 years, was driven into exile. The Vikings installed Ceolwulf II as a puppet ruler. Mercia was finished as an independent power. But Wessex had survived. Alfred used the breathing space to rebuild. He established Buzz, fortified towns spaced so that no farming settlement was more than 20 miles from refuge. He reorganized the FYRD so half served while half farmed, maintaining a standing defense. He built ships to contest Viking naval mobility. These were structural changes that addressed the systematic advantages Ivar had exploited. The speed of Viking movement? The Buzz provided defended positions that couldn't be bypassed. The inability to concentrate English forces? The rotating FYRD system maintained military readiness. The Vikings' control of sea routes? Alfred's ships challenged that dominance. During these years, Ivar disappears from English sources. Irish annals place him in Ireland, consolidating Viking control over Dublin. The annals of Ulster mention Ivar, commanding fleets, besieging strongholds, negotiating with Irish kings. He'd shifted focus from conquering England to building a Norse maritime kingdom spanning the Irish Sea. This strategic pivot reveals something essential about Viking objectives. They weren't trying to occupy and administer England. They wanted wealth and control of trade networks. When direct conquest became too costly, they shifted to controlling key ports and exacting tribute. Ivar's success in England had never been about battlefield dominance. It was about exposing the political fractures that made English kingdoms unable to resist. The great heathen army continued operating in England under other commanders. But the systematic dismantling of English kingdoms slowed. Wessex had found ways to resist. The Vikings settled into controlling the territory they'd already taken rather than continuing conquest. In 873, something remarkable happened. The sources mention it obliquely, then move on. The great heathen army split. Halfdan led half the army north into Northumbria. The other half, under Guthrum, remained focused on Wessex and Mercia. The division suggests success had become a problem. Viking armies held together through the promise of reward. Raiders expected to plunder and leave. Conquerors expected to settle on seized land. But the great heathen army had been campaigning for nearly a decade. Warriors who joined expecting quick wealth had instead spent years in England fighting an increasingly organized resistance. The army's very success created internal tensions. Those who wanted to settle and farm the conquered territory clashed with those who wanted continued raiding. Those who'd grown wealthy through plunder had different interests than new recruits seeking their fortune. Regional factions formed, warriors from Denmark versus those from Norway, those tied to Ivar versus those loyal to other jarls. Splitting allowed both factions to pursue their goals. Halfdan took warriors who wanted to settle. They parceled out Northumbrian land and established farms. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle notes this explicitly. Halfdan shared out the land of Northumbria, and they were engaged in plowing and in making a living for themselves. Vikings becoming farmers sounds like pacification. It wasn't. These settlements created permanent Norse presence in northern England. The farmers still fought when needed, but now they defended their own land. The temporary raiding army had transformed into a permanent occupation force. Guthrum's portion maintained the campaign against Wessex. But now they faced the fortifications and reorganized defenses Alfred had built. The grinding continued. In 876, the Vikings seized Wareham in Dorset. Alfred besieged it but couldn't force entry. They negotiated another peace. The Vikings swore oaths, gave hostages, and promised to leave Wessex. Then they broke the agreement, slipped away at night, and rode to Exeter. The betrayal was strategic. Viking culture valued oath-keeping within the community. Oaths to outsiders, especially Christian kings, held less weight. Guthrum needed to keep his army together with continued action. Honoring the peace meant dispersing his forces. Alfred pursued but couldn't catch them before they fortified Exeter. Another siege. Another stalemate. Then weather intervened. A Viking supply fleet was caught in a storm off Swanage. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle claims 120 ships were lost. Even if exaggerated, it was a significant disaster. Without naval support, Exeter couldn't be held. Guthrum negotiated again, retreated to Mercia, and prepared for another attempt. This cycle of negotiated peace followed by renewed attack reveals the fundamental problem. Neither side could achieve decisive victory. Vikings couldn't break Wessex's defenses. Wessex couldn't expel the Vikings from England. The war had become a series of stalemates punctuated by opportunistic Viking strikes. Then in January 878, Guthrum broke the pattern by attacking during winter. Viking armies didn't campaign in winter. Mobility depended on horses and roads. Winter turned roads to mud and required fodder that wasn't available. Armies went into winter quarters and waited for spring. Guthrum attacked Chippenham on January 6, 878, 12th night, when Alfred and his court were celebrating Christmas. The timing was perfect. The FRD was dispersed. Nobles were with their families. Nobody expected military action. The assault nearly succeeded. Alfred escaped with a small retinue. Most of his court was captured or killed. Wessex's administrative center was gone. Guthrum distributed his forces across Wessex in strongpoints, exactly as the Vikings had done in other kingdoms. For the first time since Northumbria fell, a Viking army had broken through the defenses systematically built to stop them. The buzz couldn't help if the army struck before defenders could mobilize. The rotating FYRD system meant nothing if the king had no time to call them up. Alfred retreated to the Somerset marshes around Athelney. The location was strategic, nearly inaccessible except by paths through wetlands, defensible with minimal forces, but it looked like defeat. The last independent English king was hiding in a swamp. Later legend would place Alfred burning cakes while in disguise, the humble king learning lessons from peasants. The reality was likely more desperate. He was trying to survive long enough to organize resistance. The months between January and May 878 are poorly documented. Alfred was gathering forces, sending messages to thanes and ealdormen who'd escaped capture, coordinating with resistance networks. Guthrum was consolidating control, installing administrators, and attempting to transition from conqueror to ruler. The race was whether Alfred could field an army before Guthrum stabilized his occupation. In May, Alfred emerged from the marshes and sent word to the FYRD of Somerset, Wiltshire, and Hampshire, meet at Egbertstone. They came. The sources suggest surprise at the numbers. Many had thought Alfred dead or fled overseas. The army marched to Edington and offered battle. Guthrum accepted. The battle itself is documented minimally. Asser's account. Fighting fiercely in dense order against the whole army of the pagans, he persevered resolutely for a long time. At length he gained the victory through God's will. He destroyed the Vikings with great slaughter, and pursued those who fled as far as the fortress. Modern historians debate the location, the tactics, the numbers engaged. What matters is the outcome. Guthrum's army was beaten and besieged in its fortification for 14 days. With supplies running out and no relief coming, he negotiated. The Treaty of Wedmore did something unprecedented. Instead of paying Vikings to leave, Alfred negotiated partition. Guthrum would withdraw from Wessex and rule the eastern portions of England that Vikings already controlled. The boundary roughly followed Watling Street, the old Roman road. More significantly, Guthrum agreed to be baptized. Alfred stood as his godfather. The ceremony was symbolic but politically crucial. It transformed Guthrum from a pagan invader to a Christian king, theoretically part of the same religious and political order as Alfred. The settlement created what historians call the Danelaw, the portion of England where Danish law applied. It formalized what had been developing since 865, permanent Viking settlement in England, not just raiding or temporary occupation. This wasn't total victory. Alfred hadn't expelled the Vikings. He'd negotiated a division that left them controlling half of England. But it was survival. Wessex remained independent. The systematic conquest had stopped. And Ivar, who had started it all, was likely dead. Ivar vanishes from Irish annals in 873. The Annals of Ulster entry for that year mentions his name, then nothing. No death notice, no succession, no explanation. For someone who had dominated sources for nearly a decade, the silence is conspicuous. Later sagas claim he died in England, was buried in a massive mound, protected the land from invasion through supernatural presence. These are literary inventions from centuries later. The contemporary sources simply stop mentioning him. The timing suggests he died between 873 and 878, during the years the Viking conquest stalled. Whether from illness, wounds, or age is unknowable. He was likely in his 40s or 50s by 873, old for a Viking warrior, though not impossibly so. His death changed nothing immediately because he'd built systems that didn't require him. The great heathen army continued operating. Viking settlements in Northumbria, Mercia, and East Anglia persisted. The Danelaw would exist for another 70 years before English kings gradually reconquered it. But the momentum was gone. The systematic dismantling of English kingdoms stopped. Future Viking campaigns would be about defending conquered territory or opportunistic raiding, not the methodical destruction Ivar had orchestrated. Later sagas transformed Ivar into a figure of romance and supernatural cunning. The saga of Ragnar Lothbrok presents him as born unable to walk, carried into battle on a shield, possessing wisdom that compensated for physical weakness. He becomes a symbol, the mind overcoming the body, the strategist triumphing through intellect. These stories served medieval purposes. They made complex military and political events into moral tales. They gave narrative shape to historical chaos. They transformed Ivar into a type, the disabled genius, the unlikely hero, the commander who succeeded despite overwhelming disadvantage. The reality was more interesting and more unsettling. Ivar succeeded not through compensating for weakness but by recognizing and exploiting England's structural vulnerabilities. His campaigns weren't brilliant maneuvers around his limitations. They were systematic exploitation of English kingdom's inability to coordinate, to maintain mobilized armies, to prevent Viking forces from choosing when and where to fight. The nickname, boneless, likely referred to a real physical condition. The sources are too consistent across too many independent traditions for it to be invention. But that condition didn't define his military success. If anything, it forced him towards systematic, organizational approaches that proved more effective than heroic leadership. He understood that conquering England didn't require winning every battle. It required making English kings unable to defend their kingdoms. The political fragmentation, the FYRD system's limitations, the absence of standing armies, the reliance on local lords who calculated their own interests, these were what made England vulnerable. The Vikings who followed Ivar would continue raiding and fighting for another 2 centuries. They would besiege Paris, settle Normandy, eventually conquer all of England under Knut. But they would never again systematically dismantle English kingdoms the way the Great Heathen Army did between 865 and 878. That campaign succeeded not because of military genius or supernatural cunning. It succeeded because Ivar recognized that kingdoms weren't unitary actors. They were collections of nobles making calculations about when to fight, when to negotiate, when to submit. Every campaign was designed to make submission look rational. Edmund of East Anglia fought and died because submitting meant losing the religious authority that legitimized his rule. But fighting also meant losing everything. The choice wasn't between resistance and surrender. It was between 2 forms of defeat. Burgred of Mercia submitted and was eventually driven into exile anyway. The puppet king Ceolwulf II who replaced him governed at Viking pleasure until he became inconvenient. Athelred of Wessex fought battle after battle, won at Ashdown, and died without securing his kingdom. Alfred survived by building the institutional capacity to resist, fortifications, reorganized military service, naval forces, and most importantly, the political legitimacy to demand sustained sacrifice from his subjects. That took years of patient construction and only succeeded because Wessex had the depth and resources to support it. The Danelaw transformed England permanently. Norse settlers introduced new agricultural practices, different legal traditions, and linguistic influences that persist in modern English. Place names ending in by and Thorpe mark Viking settlements. Legal concepts from Scandinavian tradition merged with Anglo-Saxon law. More fundamentally, the Viking conquest demonstrated that England's political fragmentation was existential vulnerability. The kingdoms had survived centuries of mutual conflict because no external force had the capacity to exploit their divisions. Vikings provided that force. Alfred's response, building institutional capacity for sustained defense, became the template for eventual English unification. His son Edward and grandson Athelstan would gradually reconquer the Danelaw not through heroic battles but through systematic establishment of buzz, maintenance of standing forces, and political marriage alliances that brought regions under West Saxon authority. By 954, when the last Viking king of York was expelled, England was unified under a single crown for the first time. That unification happened as a defensive response to the very conquest Ivar had orchestrated. The irony is stark. The Viking invasion that destroyed English kingdoms created the conditions for English unity. The systematic conquest that exploited political fragmentation demonstrated why fragmentation was fatal. The Great Heathen Army's success made future division impossible. Ivar left no architectural legacy, no law codes, no administrative innovations. The fortifications the Great Heathen Army built were temporary field works, now erased. The political arrangements they imposed collapsed within decades. The puppet kings they installed vanished from history. What persisted was the lesson. English rulers after Alfred understood that survival required institutional capacity for sustained military mobilization. Kingdoms needed fortified towns, organized supply networks, naval forces, and political structures that could function under stress. They learned this from watching their kingdoms destroyed by a commander who couldn't personally fight. The sagas celebrate Ivar's strategic brilliance, but the contemporary sources suggest something else. He understood that warfare wasn't primarily about battlefield tactics. It was about logistics, political calculation, and organizational capacity. The Vikings won not because they were better fighters. Individual Anglo-Saxon warriors were likely comparable, but because they maintained cohesive forces across years-long campaigns while English armies couldn't stay mobilized. This organizational advantage came from constraints. Viking armies were voluntary associations that dissolved if they stopped delivering success. That forced long-term planning. English armies were feudal obligations that could be called up but not sustained indefinitely. That created vulnerabilities around mobilization timing. Ivar's physical limitations reinforced his systematic approach. He had to succeed through organization because he couldn't succeed through personal prowess. The result was campaigns that exposed and exploited structural weaknesses rather than seeking heroic victories. The ultimate success wasn't conquering England. It was transforming how English rulers understood power. After the Viking invasions, personal prowess and royal lineage weren't enough.